In the year 2000, the CIA deliberately handed a Russian nuclear scientist a set of nuclear weapon blueprints and told him to deliver them to Iran. The blueprints were real enough to matter. They were also deliberately flawed, designed to send Iran's program down a dead end. But the scientist, the man the CIA trusted to deliver them, spotted that flaw himself. He spotted it before he ever left the country. He told the CIA. The CIA told him to deliver them anyway. What happened next would haunt American intelligence for 15 years. This is the story of Operation Merlin. To understand why the CIA would do something this dangerous, you have to go back to the 1990s. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed, but the weapons hadn't disappeared. And the scientists who built them, they were suddenly unemployed. Iran had been watching all of this very carefully. Iran's nuclear ambitions stretched back decades to before the revolution. By the mid-1990s, US intelligence believed Tehran was trying to acquire the knowledge to build a nuclear weapon. The CIA's Counter-Proliferation Division had one job: stop them. Sanctions hadn't worked. Diplomacy hadn't worked. Covert action was next. Someone inside the CIA had an idea that was either brilliant or catastrophically reckless. What if you could give Iran exactly what they wanted, but broken? Feed them a technical design, real enough to be credible, flawed enough to fail. They would waste years chasing a design that could never work. The plan had a name: Operation Merlin. It was approved under the Clinton administration sometime in the late 1990s. The device at the center of the plan was something called a fire set. A fire set is a triggering mechanism, the component that initiates a nuclear detonation sequence. The CIA had acquired Soviet designs for exactly this type of component, a device known as the TBA-480. To deliver this package, the CIA needed someone Iran would trust and someone they could control. They found him, a Russian nuclear scientist, a former Soviet weapons program expert, living quietly in the United States. He had defected, left the Soviet Union, and been taken in by the CIA. He had spent his career inside the Soviet nuclear weapons complex. He knew these systems intimately, which made him exactly what the CIA needed. As a Russian nuclear scientist approaching Iran, he would be credible. And as a CIA asset, he was, in theory, under their control. The officer who ran him, who managed the relationship between the CIA and this asset, was Jeffrey Sterling. Sterling was a CIA case officer, one of very few black officers working in the clandestine service. He handled the Russian, built the relationship, maintained the cover, ran the operation. Now the operation was ready to move into its active phase. The scientist was told what he was carrying and what he was supposed to do with it. He would travel to Vienna, Austria, a classic city of Cold War espionage, neutral ground. There, he would approach the Iranian mission and hand over the blueprints. The CIA's logic: Iran would accept the designs, try to build the device, and fail. The flaw would be deep enough that their engineers would spend years unable to solve it. Iran would be chasing a ghost. That was the plan. What the CIA hadn't fully accounted for was the man they chose to carry it. He was a weapons expert. He knew exactly what these blueprints were for. And he was about to read them very carefully. The CIA gave the scientist the blueprints to study before the trip. He needed to understand them well enough to answer questions if the Iranians asked. He was a Soviet weapons expert. He had spent his career working on exactly this type of system, so he understood what he was looking at faster than the CIA expected. And what he saw stopped him cold. The design had a flaw, not a subtle one, not something hidden deep in the mathematics. A trained nuclear engineer studying these blueprints would find it, which meant the Iranians would find it too. If Iran's engineers spotted a deliberate flaw, they would know the blueprints were a trap. They would know someone had tried to play them. And they might know the channel through which the trap arrived. The scientist understood this. He was not naive. According to James Risen, who later reported this story, the scientist went to the CIA. He told them, "These blueprints have a flaw that any competent engineer will spot." He said, "If Iran finds this, they will know they were played." The CIA listened, and then they ordered him to proceed anyway. Their reasoning, apparently, was that the overall design was still valuable enough to be useful to Iran. Even a flawed blueprint, they believed, was information Iran didn't have and couldn't easily get elsewhere. Or perhaps they simply didn't believe the flaw was as obvious as the scientist said. Either way, the order was final. Pack your bags and go to Vienna. February 2000. Vienna, Austria. Vienna had long been the world's espionage capital, neutral, trafficked by every intelligence service. The scientist arrived carrying the blueprints, documents that could reshape a nation's nuclear ambitions. His instructions were simple: approach the Iranian mission, introduce himself as a Russian scientist, offer the package. He walked to the Iranian mission. He knocked. What happened inside the mission is not fully known. The CIA's account and the scientist's account diverge. What is agreed is that the blueprints were delivered. Iran received a set of nuclear fire set blueprints from a former Soviet weapons expert. But according to Risen, something else happened, something the CIA may not have anticipated. Risen alleged that the scientist included a letter along with the blueprints. In that letter, Risen alleged, the scientist flagged the flaw, told the Iranians where to look. The CIA denies this. The scientist's motivations remain disputed to this day. What isn't disputed, the delivery was made. And Operation Merlin was now in Iran's hands. For years after the delivery, the CIA believed the operation had worked. Iran's program hadn't produced a weapon, the sabotage appeared to have taken hold. But intelligence operations are not so easy to audit. How do you know if your sabotage worked, or if your target simply found another path? Risen's reporting raised the most disturbing question about Operation Merlin. What if the flawed blueprints didn't slow Iran down? What if they actually helped? Even a flawed design tells an expert engineer a great deal about what a working design looks like. A knowledgeable engineer can sometimes reverse the flaw, deduce the correct path from where the wrong one breaks. Risen's reporting raised exactly this possibility about the operation's effect. The comparison that haunted the assessment, the A.Q. Khan network. A.Q. Khan was a Pakistani nuclear scientist who sold nuclear weapons designs to rogue states, including Iran. Iran received multiple competing sets of nuclear blueprints from different sources. Iranian engineers could, theoretically, compare the CIA's flawed design against Khan's blueprints. The flaw would become visible, and so would the correction. If this happened, the CIA's sabotage operation may have handed Iran a roadmap, not a dead end. This remains unconfirmed. The full effect of Operation Merlin on Iran's nuclear program is still classified. What is not classified is how the story got out. And how, once it got out, the US government tried to find out who leaked it. That investigation would destroy a man's career, his liberty, and arguably his life. And the investigation didn't start with the leak, it started with a lawsuit. Jeffrey Sterling had been a CIA officer since the early 1990s, one of a small number of black officers in the clandestine service. He had run the Russian scientist during Operation Merlin. He believed he had done his job well. But inside the CIA, Sterling believed he was being treated differently, passed over, excluded, marginalized. In 2001, Jeffrey Sterling filed a racial discrimination lawsuit against the CIA. The CIA invoked state secrets privilege. The lawsuit was dismissed in 2004. Sterling had now made an enemy of the CIA. And then James Risen came along. James Risen was a New York Times national security reporter, one of the best in the country. Risen had been working the Operation Merlin story since approximately 2003. He brought it to the New York Times. The Times prepared to publish. And then the White House called. The Bush administration personally appealed to the Times leadership to kill the story. They argued that publication would endanger national security, that lives were at stake. The Times held the story for approximately a year, possibly longer. Risen eventually decided to publish the story himself, in a book. In January 2006, Risen published State of War, and Operation Merlin was finally public. The government was furious. The Justice Department opens an investigation into the leak immediately. Investigators began tracking who had known about Operation Merlin and who had spoken to Risen. The trail led to Jeffrey Sterling, the former CIA officer who had handled the Russian scientist. Sterling had motive. He had sued the CIA. He had access. He had run the operation. In December 2010, Jeffrey Sterling was indicted on 10 counts of espionage. The case was almost entirely circumstantial. No physical evidence directly linking Sterling to Risen. The government subpoenaed Risen himself, tried to force him to name his source. Risen refused for years. The legal battle over his testimony dragged through the courts. The government ultimately chose not to force the issue. Risen was never made to testify. In January 2015, Jeffrey Sterling was convicted on 9 of the 10 espionage counts. Sterling maintained his innocence throughout and continued to do so after the verdict. In May 2015, he was sentenced to 3.5 years in federal prison. To this day, there has been no definitive public proof that Sterling was the source. The case raised fundamental questions about the prosecution of leakers, about the rights of journalists, about secrecy itself. And what does it mean when a government keeps its own catastrophic mistakes classified? Operation Merlin was designed to protect the United States from a nuclear-armed Iran. Whether it achieved that goal or did the opposite is still unknown. A man who maintained his innocence lost 3.5 years to a conviction built on circumstantial evidence. What is known is that a government chose to use a flawed weapon when its own courier told them it was flawed. The blueprints, sabotaged or not, ended up in the hands of a government the US suspected wanted a nuclear weapon. The rest is still classified. Operation Merlin, the CIA mission that may have helped the enemy it was designed to stop. Black frame, the only sound, the silence that follows a secret.